James Harrington stood at the edge of his property line, jaw clenched, as 5 members of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association board paraded across his front lawn like they owned it, which, according to the letter they just hand-delivered, they apparently believed they did. "As you can see, Mr. Harrington," said Elaine Winters, the HOA president, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness of someone used to getting her way. "According to the community bylaws, this strip of land falls under our common areas designation." James crossed his arms over his chest, feeling the heat rising up his neck. At 42, he spent his entire career as a civil engineer, and if there was one thing he understood with absolute clarity, it was property boundaries. "With all due respect, Mrs. Winters, I've reviewed the original plat maps. This land is deeded to me. I have the surveys to prove it." Elaine's smile never faltered, though her eyes narrowed slightly. The 4 board members behind her, all retirees with seemingly unlimited time to police their neighbors' activities, shuffled uncomfortably. "The HOA has determined otherwise," she said, tapping a manicured nail against the letter. "The board voted unanimously last night. This 30-foot section will be used for our new community walking path. Construction begins next Monday." James had purchased the 3-acre property at the edge of the Whispering Pines subdivision precisely because it offered something the cookie-cutter homes deeper in the neighborhood couldn't: privacy. The previous owner had negotiated specific exemptions from many HOA regulations, which transferred with the deed, a fact the current board seemed determined to ignore. "You can't just vote away my property rights," James said, his voice level despite his rising anger. "That's not how this works." Howard Jenkins, the board treasurer, stepped forward. "Actually, it is. Page 47, Section 12 of the bylaws indicates that the association reserves the right to reclaim easements for community enhancement projects." "For utility easements," James corrected, "not my front yard." The confrontation had drawn the attention of several neighbors, who now stood watching from a distance. James had always kept to himself, working long hours and traveling frequently for his job designing infrastructure for developing communities. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his career helping others build functional communities, yet here he was, unable to protect his own home. Elaine shrugged, the gesture dismissive. "The board's decision is final. We suggest you remove any personal items from the area before Monday." With that, she turned on her heel, the other board members following like ducklings as they marched back down his driveway. James watched them go, the letter crumpled in his fist. This wasn't the first time the HOA had overstepped. In the 18 months since he moved in, they'd cited him for everything from his mailbox design, which had been grandfathered in, to the natural landscaping he'd installed to attract local wildlife, which they claimed attracted pests. Inside his home office, James spread out the property surveys, deed restrictions, and HOA bylaws across his desk. After 3 hours of meticulous review, he was certain the HOA had no legal claim to his land. But fighting them would mean lawyers, time, and money, resources the board knew most homeowners wouldn't expend. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "How's life in suburban paradise?" James snorted. Catherine had warned him against buying in an HOA neighborhood, having fought her own battles with overzealous boards. Back then, he'd brushed off her concerns, believing his property's special exemptions would protect him. As he stared at the satellite view of his property on his computer screen, an idea began to take shape. If the HOA wanted to claim his land was public property, perhaps it was time they learned exactly what that might mean. James picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Hey, Mike," he said when his contractor friend answered. "Remember that landscaping project we discussed? I'd like to make some modifications. How do you feel about medieval-inspired design?" The weekend arrived with the low rumble of heavy machinery. James had called in every favor he was owed, and by 6 a.m. Saturday, just early enough to comply with the HOA's noise ordinance, a small fleet of construction equipment rolled onto his property. Mike D'Angelo, James' contractor friend, hopped down from a backhoe, a wide grin spraying across his weathered face. "You sure about this? Elaine Winters is going to blow a gasket." "That's what I'm counting on," James replied, unrolling the detailed plans he'd stayed up late drafting. "Everything's by the book. I checked local ordinances, building codes, and yes, even the HOA bylaws." Mike whistled as he studied the drawings. "Technically legal is the best kind of legal. Let's get to work." By mid-morning, curious neighbors had gathered at the edge of James' property. The mechanical excavator had already carved out a 6-foot-wide, 3-foot-deep trench that followed his property line exactly. Another crew was unloading massive stones from a flat truck. "What in God's name is going on here?" The shrill voice cut through the construction noise like a knife. Elaine Winters stood at the end of James' driveway, her face flushed with indignation. Behind her, Howard Jenkins was already on his phone, presumably calling other board members. James approached her with the calm demeanor he'd perfected during contentious client meetings. "Good morning, Mrs. Winters. I'm simply installing some new landscaping features. This is outrageous. You can't dig a," she sputtered, gesturing wildly at the trench. "Water feature," James supplied helpfully. "A decorative moat, if you will. Completely in line with Section 8.3 of the bylaws, which permits water features that enhance property aesthetics." Howard rushed forward, waving his phone. "The bylaws were meant for fountains and small ponds, not whatever this monstrosity is." "The bylaws don't specify size limitations for water features," James countered, pulling out a laminated copy of the relevant section. "I've studied them thoroughly." By noon, the commotion had drawn an even larger crowd. James had always been a private person, but he found himself surprisingly unbothered by the attention. Several neighbors actually approached him with quiet words of support, sharing their own stories of HOA overreach. "They cited me for having a bird feeder last month," confided Mrs. Abernethy, an elderly woman from 3 doors down. "Called it an unauthorized feeding station. My husband and I have been here 30 years, longer than any of those board members." As the day progressed, the moat took shape. The stonemasons began lining it with carefully fitted rocks, creating not just a barrier but a genuinely attractive landscape feature. The water system, complete with filtration and subtle lighting, would be installed the following day. But the most dramatic element was yet to come. Shortly after 2 p.m., a delivery truck arrived carrying a massive wrought iron gate and matching fencing sections. The ornate metalwork featured a design that somehow managed to be both elegant and imposing. James had commissioned it months ago for a different purpose, intending to install it at the driveway entrance, but this new application seemed far more fitting. The craftsman had incorporated elements that echoed the architectural style of James's home, while adding flourishes that wouldn't look out of place protecting a medieval manor. The lane returned with reinforcements, the entire HOA board, and a man in a suit who James guessed was their attorney. They huddled at the edge of his property, pointing and gesticulating. James pretended not to notice, focusing instead on reviewing the placement of the gate pillars with the installation crew. Finally, Elaine marched over, legal counsel in tow. "Mr. Harrington, this is Franklin Weiss, the association's attorney. This construction clearly violates multiple covenants. We're prepared to seek an immediate injunction." Franklin cleared his throat. "Mrs. Winters is correct. This structure appears to violate height restrictions, setback requirements, and—" "Actually," James interrupted, pulling out a thick folder from his truck. "I've obtained all the necessary permits from the county." He handed over copies of the documentation. "You'll see everything is in order, including approvals for the water feature depth, the structural engineering for the gate, and confirmation that all setbacks comply with local code. But the board needs to approve any exterior modifications," Elaine insisted. James smiled. "According to my deed restrictions, which were properly recorded with the county, my property has specific exemptions from those approval requirements. The previous owner negotiated them when the development was first established. Those exemptions transfer with the property." Franklin, the attorney, flipped through the paperwork, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he whispered something to Elaine. Her face reddened further. "And about that walkway you're planning," James continued, "I've taken the liberty of having the actual property lines professionally surveyed and marked." He gestured to the small flags that clearly showed the boundaries, all of which fell well within his new moat. "You'll find the recorded survey with the county matches exactly what I've marked here." As the attorney pulled Elaine aside for a hushed conversation, Mike sidled up to James. "You know they're not going to give up that easily." James nodded, watching the board members' animated discussion. "I'm counting on it. But neither am I." By sunset, the basic structure of James' defense was in place. The moat, not yet filled with water, encircled the front portion of his property in a graceful curve. The imposing gate stood ready at the driveway entrance, its twin pillars anchored in concrete that would need overnight to cure. As James stood back to survey the day's work, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction. Tomorrow would bring phase 2 of his plan and undoubtedly more HOA drama. But for now, he allowed himself to enjoy the small victory of seeing genuine admiration in his neighbors' eyes as they passed by to inspect his landscaping improvements. The medieval-inspired design wasn't just a barrier against HOA overreach, it was becoming a statement. And James was just getting started. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for filling a moat. James had barely finished his first cup of coffee when the water trucks arrived, followed closely by the landscaping crew bringing mature plants, decorative boulders, and even a small collection of water lilies. "Going for the full medieval castle experience minus the crocodiles?" Mike asked, joining James on the front porch. "The county drew the line at livestock and water features," James replied with a straight face. "I checked." They watched as the water began flowing into the stone-lined channel, creating a surprisingly serene effect as it caught the morning light. The landscapers worked efficiently, transforming what might have been an eyesore into something that looked like it belonged on the cover of a luxury home magazine. "You turned a protest into art," Mike observed. "Smart move." James nodded. "It's harder to argue against something beautiful." By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered again, this time including people from neighboring subdivisions who'd heard about the castle moat through social media posts. Someone had even created a hashtag #MoatmanStandsUp. Around 11, a county vehicle pulled up. A woman in a khaki uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Harrington, I'm Diane Lopez, County Code Enforcement. We've received multiple complaints about your construction project." James had been expecting this. "Of course, I'd be happy to walk you through everything." For the next 45 minutes, James guided Ms. Lopes around the property, showing her each permit, pointing out how every aspect of the installation met or exceeded code requirements. He prepared a binder with tabbed sections for each potential concern. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, Ms. Lopes said, finally making a few notes on her clipboard. "And I've never seen anyone so thoroughly prepared for an inspection." "I believe in doing things right the first time," James replied. "Well, as far as I can tell, everything is in compliance. Unusual, certainly, but compliant." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "Between us, I've dealt with the Whispering Pines HOA before. They're particularly zealous." James smiled. "That's one word for it." Ms. Lopes had just driven away when 3 police cruisers pulled up, lights flashing. The HOA had escalated further. James met the officers calmly, going through the same explanations and documentation he'd shown the code enforcement officer. After verifying that everything was indeed permitted and that the dispute was civil rather than criminal in nature, the officers departed, though not before one young officer asked if he could take a photo of the moat for his D&D group. Shortly after the police left, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into James' driveway. The vehicle had barely stopped when Bernard Phillips, the HOA's vice president and also the wealthiest resident of Whispering Pines, emerged from the back seat. Unlike Elaine's red-faced approach, Bernard moved with the calculated precision of someone accustomed to getting his way through money rather than volume. His designer suit seemed out of place on a Sunday afternoon in the suburbs. "Mr. Harrington," he said, extending his hand, "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." James shook the offered hand cautiously. "Is that so?" "Indeed. While Elaine can be passionate about preserving our community standards, I prefer more practical solutions." Bernard gestured toward the moat. "This is quite impressive, actually. Creative problem solving. I respect that." "Thank you," James replied, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "However," Bernard continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "this situation has become something of a public relations issue for the association. Social media, you understand. Not good for property values." "I'm simply exercising my property rights," James said. Bernard nodded. Of course. And perhaps we've been overzealous in our interpretation of the bylaws regarding your land." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "The board has authorized me to make you an offer. We're prepared to formally recognize your property boundaries and grant a permanent variance for your unique landscaping features." James took the envelope but didn't open it. "In exchange for, we would need you to sign an agreement not to discuss the details of our arrangement publicly, and perhaps make a few cosmetic adjustments. Nothing major. The gate is a bit medieval for Whispering Pines aesthetic. And the walking path." Bernard waved his hand dismissively. "We've identified an alternative route through genuinely common areas." James considered the envelope in his hand. It would be the easiest solution, wave a white flag, accept the peace offering, return to his private life. But something about Bernard's smug certainty that money would solve the problem irked him deeply. "I appreciate the offer," James said finally, "but I think I'll continue with my project as planned." Bernard's pleasant expression hardened. "That would be unwise, Mr. Harrington. The association has considerable resources." "So do I," James replied evenly. After Bernard departed, James called his sister, Catherine. When he explained the situation, she laughed so hard she could barely speak. "A moat? An actual moat? Oh, Jamie, you've outdone yourself." Once she recovered, her tone turned serious. "But be careful. HOAs can make your life miserable if they want to." "I know," James acknowledged, "but someone needs to stand up to them." "Well, if anyone can outstubborn an HOA board, it's you," Catherine said. "Remember when you built that treehouse after Mom said no?" "I presented architectural drawings and a safety analysis," James protested. "It was the most structurally sound treehouse in the neighborhood." "You were at 11. By evening, the moat was filled and circulating, the underwater lights creating a gentle glow as dusk fell. The gate installation was complete, the massive wrought iron structure now functional. James had added a small wooden footbridge across the moat by the mailbox, practical, but also enhancing the whimsical castle aesthetic. As he stood admiring the completed project, a car pulled up. To his surprise, Mrs. Abernathy emerged, accompanied by several other longtime residents. "We brought you something," she said, holding out a small package. Inside was a handmade flag bearing a hastily designed but charming coat of arms, a house with a moat, a gate, and the Latin phrase "defendit domum suum." He defends his home. "The ladies in my sewing circle made it," Mrs. Abernathy explained. "We thought your castle should have a proper banner." Touched, James thanked them. After they left, he mounted the flag on. The county courthouse was unusually crowded for a Monday morning. As James made his way through security, he recognized dozens of faces from Whispering Pines. Word of the emergency hearing had spread rapidly through neighborhood text chains and social media. "Mr. Harrington." Mrs. Abernathy waved him over to where she sat with a group of neighbors. "We're here to support you." James was touched by the gesture but concerned about the seriousness of the situation. He'd spent most of Sunday night reviewing documents with Patricia Zhang, a property rights attorney who had agreed to represent him on short notice. "This is about more than your moat," Patricia had explained during their meeting. "It's about establishing clear precedent regarding the limits of HOA authority in this county." Now, as they settled into the courtroom, James saw the HOA contingent filing in, not just the board members, but Franklin Weiss, accompanied by two additional attorneys. Bernard Phillips sat directly behind them, immaculate in another expensive suit, scrolling through his phone with apparent disinterest. Judge Eleanor Walsh entered, her expression suggesting she was not pleased to have her Monday morning occupied by a dispute over landscape features. "I've reviewed the filings," she began after the formalities concluded. "Whispering Pines Homeowners Association seeks an emergency injunction requiring the immediate removal of unauthorized structures built by the defendant, James Harrington." "Is that correct?" Franklin Weiss stood. "Yes, Your Honor. And we request expedited relief given the ongoing harm to the community aesthetic and property values." Judge Walsh turned to Patricia. "And the defendant's position?" Patricia rose. "Your Honor, my client has acted fully within his rights as a property owner. He has obtained all necessary permits and has adhered to all applicable building codes. Furthermore, his property carries specific recorded exemptions from many HOA restrictions properly documented when the subdivision was established." What followed was 2 hours of detailed arguments about property boundaries, easements, and the specific language of HOA covenants. The HOA's legal team presented enlarged photographs of James' property, dramatically highlighting the moat and gate as if they were documenting a crime scene. "This medieval monstrosity makes a mockery of our community standards," Franklin argued. "It diminishes neighboring property values and establishes a dangerous precedent of individualism that threatens the very purpose of a homeowners association." Patricia countered by presenting the original subdivision plats, James' deed with its specific exemptions, and all the county permits and approvals. "The plaintiff's real complaint," she argued, "is not that my client has violated any valid restriction, but that he has refused to surrender property rights that the association wrongfully attempted to claim." Throughout the presentations, Judge Walsh asked pointed questions of both sides. When Elaine Winters took the stand, the judge seemed particularly interested in the HOA's decision-making process. "So," Judge Walsh said, studying a document, "your board voted to designate Mr. Harrington's front yard as common area without notifying him in advance?" "We interpreted the bylaws as giving us that authority," Elaine replied stiffly. "And this interpretation was based on Section 12, paragraph 47 clearly states." "I've read it," the judge interrupted. "It refers specifically to utility easements and not unilaterally declaring private property to be common area." When James took the stand, the HOA's attorney attempted to paint him as a troublemaker who had moved into the community with the intention of disrupting its harmony. "Mr. Harrington, would you say you have a problem with authority?" Franklin asked. "Objection," Patricia called. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Walsh ruled. Franklin adjusted his approach. "Mr. Harrington, as you consider how your neighbors might feel about living next to a property that looks like it belongs in a Renaissance fair?" Before Patricia could object again, James responded, "Actually, I've received considerable positive feedback from my neighbors." He gestured toward the courtroom, where Mrs. Abernathy and others nodded vigorously. "Many of them have told me they find it both aesthetic and inspiring." The judge called a brief recess to review some of the documents more thoroughly. In the hallway outside, neighbors approached James with words of encouragement. "I've lived in Whispering Pines for 20 years, said Mr. Jenkins, a retired teacher. "Watched them gradually add more and more restrictions. Started with sensible stuff, no broken down cars on lawns, that sort of thing. Now they send violation notices if your grass is half an inch too tall. They fine me for planting vegetables in my backyard," added another woman. "Called them unauthorized agricultural activities." When court resumed, Judge Walsh appeared to have reached a decision more quickly than expected. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," she began. "This case presents an interesting intersection of property rights." 6 months later, James stood on his front porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the early morning sun glint off the water in his now famous moat. The water lilies had flourished over the summer, and the ornamental grasses along the banks swayed gently in the autumn breeze. What had begun as an act of defiance had evolved into a genuine point of neighborhood pride. Tour buses from nearby towns occasionally drove by, and the local garden club had even asked to include his property on their annual tour. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Happy Election Day, Mr. President. Try not to let the power go to your head." James smiled, still not entirely comfortable with his newest role. After Judge Walsh's ruling, the special HOA election had proceeded as ordered. Despite his initial reluctance, James had allowed his name to be put forward as a candidate for the board. The result had been unprecedented. A record turnout of homeowners and a complete overhaul of leadership, with James receiving more votes than any candidate in the association's history. "I didn't build a moat to become HOA president," he had protested when neighbors first approached him about running. "That's exactly why you should do it," Mrs. Abernathy had countered. "Someone who understands boundaries, both literally and figuratively." Bernard Phillips had been surprisingly supportive, providing James with insights into the association's finances and operations that might have otherwise taken months to uncover. The man remained an enigma, self-interested certainly, but also pragmatic enough to recognize which way the wind was blowing. Reform is inevitable, Bernard had told him over lunch at the country club. Better to help shape it than resist it. The first board meeting under the new leadership had drawn a standing-room-only crowd. James had opened with a simple statement of principles. "This association exists to maintain community standards, not to micromanage our lives or infringe on our property rights. We need rules, but they should be clear, fair, and enforced with common sense." Over the following months, the Bylaw Review Committee, which included both longtime residents and newer homeowners, had meticulously revised the community regulations. They eliminated archaic and overreaching restrictions while preserving those that genuinely protected property values and community aesthetics. The resulting document was half the length of the original bylaws, but twice as clear. Not everyone was pleased, of course. Elaine Winters and a few stalwart supporters had formed what they called the Traditional Values Coalition, dedicated to preserving the character and standards of Whispering Pines. They still sent occasional emails to all residents warning of impending chaos and plummeting property values under the new regime. Reality told a different story. Property values had actually increased since the changes, partly due to the positive press coverage of the Moat Man revolution and the resulting interest in the neighborhood. 3 homes had sold above asking price in the past month alone. More importantly, there was a palpable shift in the community's atmosphere. Neighbors who had once hurried from car to house to avoid potential violations now lingered to chat in their front yards. Children's basketball hoops appeared in driveways without triggering citation notices. Mrs. Abernathy had installed her bird feeders, plural now, and started a popular neighborhood birdwatching club. The sound of a car pulling into his driveway brought James back to the present. Mike emerged from his pickup truck, carrying a toolbox. "Ready for the big unveiling?" he asked, nodding toward the gate. Today marked the final addition to James's medieval-inspired landscaping, a custom-made sign for the entrance. Together, they mounted the hand-carved wooden plaque beside the gate. It read simply, "Castle Harrington. All are welcome. Tyrants beware." "Perfect," Mike said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. As if on cue, Mrs. Abernathy and several other neighbors appeared, carrying pastries and coffee for an impromptu celebration. "The sign is wonderful," Mrs. Abernathy declared, "just the right touch." While the neighbors chatted, James's phone rang, Bernard Phillips calling. "Have you considered my offer?" Bernard asked without preamble. The offer had come 3 weeks ago, a partnership position in Bernard's development company, focusing on creating communities with more thoughtful governance structures. "I'm still thinking it over," James answered honestly. "Don't think too long. The market is moving." After hanging up, James rejoined his neighbors. They had spread a picnic blanket near the moat and were sharing stories about the neighborhood's transformation. "Remember when the Hendersons got fined for having the wrong shade of beige on their shutters?" Someone was saying. 3 different board meetings about the definition of desert sand versus sandstone. Or the great holiday decoration debate of 2018, another added, when they tried to limit us to white lights only. James listened, occasionally contributing a thought, but mostly content to observe. He still had the engineer's preference for solving problems over socializing, but he found an unexpected satisfaction helping rebuild the community's governance from the ground up. Later that afternoon, as the small gathering dispersed, Catherine arrived for her monthly visit. She whistled appreciatively as she passed through the gate and crossed the footbridge over the moat. I have to admit, it looks less ridiculous than I imagined, she said, hugging her brother. Actually, it's rather impressive. It serves its purpose, James replied. Which was? Originally, to keep the HOA off my lawn. Now, he gestured around at the neighborhood. It reminds everyone that boundaries matter, but bridges matter too. They walked inside, where James showed her the plans he'd been working on. A proposal for a neighborhood common green space that would be truly communal, designed with input from residents of all ages. So if you're really going all in on this community leadership thing, Catherine observed. Never would have predicted that. Neither would I, James admitted. That evening after Catherine left, James took a walk around the neighborhood. He nodded to Mr. Jenkins, who was setting up a telescope in his driveway to show the neighborhood kids the rings of Saturn. He waved to the paddles, who had transformed their front yard.